Howdy, everybody. Welcome to another great episode of Cowboys of the Osage. I'm one of your hosts, Cody. I got my other co-host right over here, as always, rodeo historian, Mr. Jimbo Snively. Hey, Jimbo, what's going on over there?
Oh, Cody, it's just another great day in Osage, man. We've got a real special guest today. He's a lifelong Osage County resident. He grew up right over on the west side. He knows near the Chapman-Barnard Ranch. He knows that ranch as well as anybody. And in fact, when they started the Nature Conservancy, bought the ranch, he became the director of the Tallgrass Prairie Preserve for 18 years. So, and he's also a world-class wildlife and nature photographer. He's had 4 books published. He's had his work in every major newspaper and magazine in the country. I mean, I'm talking about New York Times, LA Times, USA Today. It'd be easier to name the ones that he hasn't had work in than the one that he has. And he also has 100 photographs on permanent display at the Smithsonian in D.C. It doesn't get much bigger than that. And he's a retired lawyer, although he's still a municipal judge in several cities here in the county. And, of course, I'm talking about Mr. Harvey Payne, Pusk, Oklahoma. Harvey, thanks for coming in today.
Well, thank you. It's my pleasure.
Great to have you.
We're happy to have you over here, Harvey. This one might be above our pay grade today, Jimbo.
It might be. I might be.
Holy moly, articles in every paper in the nation. And
all of them.
Accomplished author, photographer. Mr. Harvey Payne, we're so happy to have you. We're so happy to have you. Let's start from the top, Mr. Payne. Tell us your long-standing ties to Osage County. What are your longest ties to Osage County?
I started out being born here, born in Shidler, which is a pretty small town in the western part of the county, and raised on a ranch west and north of Shidler, right on the Osage-K County line. In fact, we ran cattle in K County. We lived in K County, but we had land and ran cattle in Osage County too. And did that until, you can graduate from school, but you can't graduate from home. And whenever I would go home from school, which was every weekend when I was in college, Dad always had a long list of things to do. And, I wouldn't trade the way we were raised for anything. My brother Joe and I would shovel off by hand a truckload of ensilage before we went to school when we were in high school. That's a lot of work, but Mom would get up and have breakfast ready to eat, and we would get up and eat, and we would be outside by the time it was light enough to see. It wasn't always light enough to see. But we would feed cattle before we went to school, and then we would take our coveralls off and hightail it to school. We lived at the end of the line. We were the first one. If we rode a bus, we were the first ones on, the last ones off. And so we would go to Shidler, and then every weekend, every evening, Dad had a long list of things to do. But, like I said, I wouldn't trade that for anything, because he taught us responsibility, he taught us accountability, and he taught us how to work. He had me on a tractor when I was 6 years old, working in the field by myself. I tell people most of what I did when I was a kid would be called child abuse now. But then it was just part of life on the farm and ranch. I mean, everybody made a hand. You had to.
Everybody pulled their weight.
That's right. And never thought anything about it. And like I said, I think that was the biggest favor they could have done for myself and my 4 brothers, is to teach us how to work and how to be responsible. I mean, you never slipped anything by Dad, anything. Sometimes I thought I could, but I never could. One time we had cattle and we had farmland. And by the time I was 9, I was the chief farmer. I did about all of our farming. And if it was too wet to work in the field, there were always cattle to work. And one day we thought we had it made because we didn't have any cattle to work and it was too wet to work in the field. Well, we were wrong. My brothers and I were wrong. Dad gave us hoes and sent us to the cornfield and wanted us to hoe the rows of corn. So we hoed about the first 20 yards and thought we could fool him because we didn't think he'd walk down those rows to see if we'd hoed the whole row, which was over a half a mile. And he found out we'd just hoed about the first 20 yards. So we got in trouble for that too.
What was some of your first memories of the Chapman-Barnard Ranch?
Well, the Chapman-Barnard Ranch, when I was born, my grandparents, my mother's parents, lived in Apperson, which is just west and a little south of Shidler. And in 1945, they moved to Hewins, Kansas. I was born in 1947. And so whenever we would go see my grandparents, we had to drive through the Chapman-Barnard Ranch to get there. Hewins, Kansas is just north of the Oklahoma State line and just north of the Chapman-Barnard Ranch. So we would have to drive through the Chapman-Barnard Ranch every time we went to see them. And I thought that was the most beautiful country in the world. It was just amazing to me. And then when I was in high school, we ran cattle on the Chapman-Barnard Ranch. And Dad had leased some of their pastures and stocked it. And then one year we had to drive cattle. You know, shipping cattle was a pretty big job. And the Midland Valley Railroad came through the Chapman-Barnard Ranch. You know, the Blackland Pens at one time was the largest cattle shipping point in the country, other than someplace like Kansas City. So we shipped cattle from there one year. We also shipped cattle from Hardy. The Midland Valley went on up to Hardy and then on to Kansas. And we shipped cattle from the railroad station at Hardy as well. But that, you know, that was before you hauled everything. And you did most of your work on the back of a horse. And driving cattle that far was a pretty big job. You'd have to have a couple of guys ahead of the cattle herd to get other people's, I mean, you're going through other people's ranches, and you had to move their cattle out of the way. You had to know where the gates were. That was a big consideration. And be able to open them. And some of those ranchers took pride in having gates that were really hard to open, especially for a little kid. And so you'd have to move the cattle out of the way, and then you'd have several others pushing the cattle on and keeping them from getting mixed up with the neighbor's cattle.
How many would you take up there at a time in one herd?
Oh, gosh, I don't remember. It would have been, probably 100 or 125. It wasn't a real big herd, but it could sure seem like a big herd at times. And Dad liked to run steers that had about a quarter Brahma in them. And the more they get pushed, the wilder they get and the more combative they get. And sometimes they were pretty hard to handle. You had to be paying attention all the time. You had to know what you were doing. And if you missed a step, you had somebody telling you about it real fast.
That ranch up there, I read an article here a while back in, I believe, 1940. It was the largest ranch in Oklahoma.
I wouldn't doubt it. Nobody knows how big it was. I asked Mary Barnard Lawrence, Mr. Barnard's daughter, and I've asked other family members how big it was at its apex. Everybody admits that it was over 100,000 acres, but nobody knows for sure how big it was. And that would have included a lot of leased land. Dad's ranch was 6 miles north and about 7 or 8 miles west of Shidler. And at one time, he told me that was part of the Chapman-Barnard Ranch. But I do know when Mr. Chapman died in 1966, he had 35,000 acres in his name. And when Mr. Barnard died in 1970, he had a little over 29,000 acres in his name. But they didn't always buy what they leased. And then what they owned, they kept the most productive acres and sold off the less productive acres.
Harvey, how do you accumulate that kind of land? It was all Indian land to begin with. How do you accumulate that size ranch altogether, pretty much? That seemed like quite a...
That is almost impossible to do. Yep. It would be as difficult then as it is now. And trying to put together something like that would be a very, very big task. Mr. Chapman and Mr. Barnard, James A. Chapman and Horace G. Barnard, and they were two cowboys from Waxahachie, Texas. And they came up to the Tulsa area over 100 years ago, and at that time, Glenpool was just being discovered as an oil field, and they started buying leases in the Glenpool area. Mr. Chapman's father-in-law had some pretty good resources. I suspect, without really knowing, that's one of the money sources. They weren't wildcatters. They would go into proven areas and buy leases, but they had the Midas touch. It seemed like every time they drilled a well, it was a gusher, and every time they got a lease, it was a big producing lease. And so they made a fortune in the oil business. And they had production in Oklahoma, in Texas, and in Kansas. If you read the book called The McMahon, the story of the McMahon Oil Company, which is what they called their company, in the Cushing field alone, they had 40,000 barrels a day of oil produced on their leases. That's the kind of money they had. But true to their roots, and Mr. Barnard was the field man. Mr. Chapman stayed in town. But true to their cowboy roots, they started buying ranch land. And the ranch land in Osage County is, if not the best in the world, it's certainly close to the very best in the world. And so that's why they were attracted to Osage County. They not only had a big ranch here, they had a big ranch in southern Oklahoma, they had 2 in Texas and 1 in New Mexico. But I can't help but think, being the Cowboys that they were, that the ranch in Osage County had to be the apple of their eye.
I bet it was.
It would have to be. I mean, it's... Lee Bass owns about 50,000 acres that wraps around the Tallgrass Prairie Preserve, including the 35,000 acres that James A. Chapman owned. Their ranch manager told me some years ago, and they keep detailed records on cattle gains in their pastures, by each pasture. And they own lands in Kansas as well, some pretty big ranches in Kansas. They told me that their least productive acres in Osage County were more productive than their most productive acres in Chase County, Kansas.
Really?
But we get here an average of about 38 inches of rainfall a year. In the Flint Hills in Kansas, they get closer to 23. So this is a more productive landscape.
I see.
And Chapman and Barnard loved it. But to answer your question, their first purchase was 1,200 acres from 2 cowboys named Snyder and White in 1915. And that's where the bunkhouse is now, their ranch headquarters. But you're exactly right. This was the Osage Indian Reservation from 1872 until 1906, when Congress passed the Allotment Bill of June 28, 1906, that provided for the allotment of the Osage Reservation to the individual tribal members. But it had a provision that they couldn't sell that land if they were considered incompetent without the approval of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. So to be able to buy anything in Osage County was difficult. And putting together a 100,000-acre ranch, it would be easier to walk to the moon.
Right.
It's just impossible.
Yep.
I don't know how they did it. They had to be very good businessmen. I knew their attorney, Bill Bell, in Tulsa, and let me tell you, he was a tough customer. And they had the best legal representation. I'm sure they had the best people working for them to put land together. But I've heard a lot of stories, and you probably have too. Those allotted acres to the Osages were not fenced out. And the Osages that owned them didn't live on the land. They lived generally in Pawhuska, Hominy, or Fairfax. And so they knew they owned some land up there somewhere. They didn't know just exactly where. And I've heard that Mr. Chapman and Mr. Barnard, if they would lease it, their rate of rental was pretty low. And if they would buy it, their purchase price was pretty low. I think they were pretty tough to do business with. Yep. But you know, then only the strong survived. The weaker customers didn't make it.
Right.
How many cowboys did they have employed up there?
You know, they didn't have that many full-time. We had The Nature Conservancy bought the 29,000 plus Barnard portion of the Chapman-Barnard Ranch in 1989. And it was under an existing cattle grazing lease that expired January 1, 1991. So we got possession January 1, 1991. I was hired as preserve director on a part-time basis. I wasn't willing to walk away from a law practice, and I did not apply for the job. The Nature Conservancy contacted me, but they said they wanted someone from this area and someone that was a supporter of the preserve idea, and there weren't very many of them, and someone with a ranching background. And so you add up the people that would fill that bill, it wouldn't have been very many people. Might have been one. And so they hired me December 15, 1990 to be the preserve director. In the spring of 1991, we invited all of the old cowboys and cowgirls that we could find that had ever worked on the Chapman-Barnard Ranch. And we had a couple of fellas smoke about 12 or 15 briskets, and we fed them a barbecue that was pretty nice. And we had about 100 people show up. It was amazing. And then we had James P. Ronda, Jim Ronda, a TU Western history professor that occupied the Barnard Chair of Western History at the University of Tulsa that was endowed by Mr. Chapman in Mr. Barnard's honor. He interviewed these cowboys and cowgirls, and then Scott Swearingen, another TU professor, videotaped them. And those tapes are at the archives at the University of Tulsa Library. And then Jim's wife, Jean, followed it up with other interviews later. But they told us there might not have been more than 7 or 8 cowboys living there the year round. But what they would do is during shipping and receiving seasons, they would hire extra help and bring cowboys in from other ranches. So when they were shipping their cattle or receiving cattle, they might have 40 cowboys up there. And that's a lot, but it took a lot because the pastures were big, the pastures were real big, and a lot of miles from one end to the other. And they didn't have horse trailers, they rode wherever they were going. And they told us, the cardinal rule, and I knew that, the cardinal rule when you're going to work in a pasture, no matter how far it is from your house or your barn, you're there as soon as it's light enough to see to be ready to start working. And so they would have to get up sometimes, they would say at 2 or 3 in the morning, and saddle their horse, have their breakfast, catch their horse. And Mr. Ben Johnson told them which horse each one of them had to ride that day. He would point out their horse for them. They'd rope him, saddle him, feed him. They'd go have breakfast, and they'd start riding in the dark. And they might have to ride 8 or 10 miles to where they were going to work to be there as soon as it got light enough to see. So it was quite a deal. When Jim Ronda interviewed these cowboys, it was really interesting. One fellow was there named Dallas Poteet. Dallas Poteet worked there in 1923. And they told us the average cowboy got $40 a month. They had no benefits. If you got hurt, that was on you. You should have been more careful. And they said they got off 3 days a year. That's counting weekends. And they said they usually didn't get the full 3 days. They said they got a day in Christmas and a half a day for Thanksgiving, and a lot of time that was it. But they talked about the trials and tribulations and how difficult it was to ride in the dark, either going to where they were going to work or coming back, and it being a pitch black night. And if there weren't any stars, it'd be cloudy and no moon. You couldn't tell where you were going. Thank goodness horses can see in the dark and pay attention, but you had to find a gate. And finding the gate in the pasture that you had to ride through was a pretty big challenge sometimes. So they talked about all the difficulties they had working there. And then Jim would ask each one of them, if you had your life to live over, would you work on the Chapman-Barnard Ranch? And every one of them said, in a minute, it was the best time of my life. But Dallas Poteet, he was a bronc buster. And his motto was if it grows hair, I can ride it. That's pretty ambitious. But he was getting about $10 a month more than the other cowboys. And then he found out that the reason he was is because he had the outlaw string to break. The ones nobody could ride, he had to ride. But it was really touching. These guys, so many of them would just work there a few years and they would go off and do something else. He went off to Anadarko or Ardmore rather, and made it rich in the oil business. But it was really interesting. All these cowboys in the golden age of ranching, when you ranch from a horse instead of the seat of a pickup, they always, no matter what they did later in life, they always identified themselves as a Chapman-Barnard cowboy.
That's amazing.
It was touching. It was very, very touching. And thank goodness we did that, because in 10 years, practically all of those people were dead, and we couldn't have interviewed them. And that bit of knowledge would have been lost forever.
Right. Well, you told one story the other day about the road going up there, how bad it was, and about Mr. Chapman having a little encounter.
Yeah. That, the road, a lot of people turn around now when the blacktop ends.
Right.
But that road then was just a dirt road. There wasn't any gravel. And it would have been rutted really bad. And I remember when I was a kid, we lived on a similar road. Mom and Dad would literally tell people how to drive to get out of there, to keep from getting stuck. They would coach them before they left. But the road from Pawhuska to the Chapman-Barnard Ranch, it's about 18 miles. And it was barely passable much of the time. So anyway, Mr. Chapman was driving up there from Tulsa. He lived in the Mayo Hotel in Tulsa, and he was driving up to the ranch. He didn't go up there very often. Well, he got held up by a highwayman. The guy stopped his car and robbed him and stuck a gun in his face and wanted his money. And Mr. Chapman just had a few dollars. And this robber said, "Mr. Chapman, I know you're one of the richest men in the country. I ought to just kill you, but I'm going to let you go this time. But next time, you better have a bunch of cash with you." And that's why he always carried several $1,000s with him after that. That's one of the stories the Cowboys told us at the Cowboy reunion.
Funny.
Going back to those old days and those big pastures up there, a lot of people, and you were saying something about days of the feed truck now, but, in those days, they probably still had to feed those cattle in the winter somehow.
Sure they did.
So can you enlighten me and everybody else on how that went down?
Well, I can tell you what I know, which isn't a lot.
Yes, sir.
But the winters back then, I think, were harder than the winters now. A lot colder and more snow. And, you'd have to chop ice for the cattle to drink from the ponds if they wintered cattle. And Chapman and Barnard, they didn't do the same thing every year. They would ship a lot of cattle up on the rail cars from Texas and summer them there, and then at the end of the summer they'd ship them out. So they didn't always winter a lot of cattle there. But what they would do is they would have cake houses, and these are just little scattered shanties that they would have in the pastures scattered around the countryside, and they would stock those with cake from a wagon. They'd have to haul it there with a team and wagon. And ride their horse there and get in the cake house and then scatter 100-pound sacks of cake. And that's what they were. They were in 100-pound burlap bags. Let me tell you, at the end of the day, you knew you'd done something. And I'll never forget the time. It always happened at the worst possible time. But Saturday afternoons is when Thornton York, a fellow from here in Pawhuska, would deliver a semi-load of cake to our house. A semi-load of 100-pound bags that my brothers and I would put in a boxcar. And you had to stack it to the very top of that boxcar. And Thornton would wheel them back on the dolly, and my brother Joe and I would manhandle those 100-pound bags into that boxcar. And we had just got through shoveling ensilage all morning. We were tired to start with and thought we were done for the day, and it always seemed to happen on a Saturday afternoon when we were certainly home, and Dad always had to be someplace else. It didn't hurt us a bit, but we sure knew what 100-pound bags of cake were. And so that's what those cowboys would do. They'd have to ride their horse. And let me tell you, riding a horse across an open prairie with a strong north wind, and the worse the conditions were, the more the cattle needed fed. And riding a horse across a prairie into a strong north wind with snow blowing is no fun. It's no walk in the park. And if being a cowboy is glamorous, the glamour came off real fast then.
And Cody, they didn't have the clothes like they have now, the insulated coveralls, none of that. My grandfather worked up there in the 30s, and like Harvey said, they had some terrible winters there, 35, 36, when he was there. And he said when they had a little money in the summertime, they didn't have enough sense to buy clothes. And that winter had hit them, and they'd have a Levi jacket and cowboy boots and a cowboy hat, you know. He said there was times when he didn't know if he was going to make it back to the headquarters, you know, just so cold.
Yeah,
so it's brutal country to feed a horseback.
Oh,
you know.
yeah, and big country, too.
Oh, yeah.
And there weren't so many trees then either.
No. Still not a lot of them, and most of it. But it was a crazy experience. They wanted him to move up to Buck Creek when he got married in 1936. He said, no, I'm going to go rodeo. He'd had enough of it.
You know, the coldest I've ever been, Jimbo, I was at the horse sale at Chaplain one time, Chaplain, Missouri, over there in the middle of winter. And of course, my dad got there early because they were buying the horses as they came in. They call it hopping the alley is what they call it. And yeah, it was deathly cold. I had a little old pair of ostrich boots my dad got me, and they were way too thin, and I had the way too thin a jacket. I think that's the coldest I've ever been over there at Joplin. So probably not near as cold as the guys out on the cake.
Right.
With the 100-pound sack of cake on each side of them, riding around on their horse.
Harvey, did they say how many times they got to go to town or how often they went to town, the Cowboys?
Usually Saturday night. I don't remember specifically. I remember a story about Ben Johnson Jr., and he liked to go to town. And he went to town Saturday night. Well, Sunday morning, Mr. Chapman was there on the ranch. And Sunday morning, that's just another day. I mean, you work Sundays just like you worked any other day. And so son's dad, Ben Johnson Sr., was the foreman. And so they got the Cowboys up and around early that morning like they did every morning. Well, Ben hadn't made it back from town yet. And so his dad said, we'll just catch his horse. We'll saddle it and tie it up out here. They had a hitching rail. We'll tie it up. He'll be home, and he'll be back to the bunkhouse. He'll get on his horse. He'll come and help us. Well, he didn't show up. And the Cowboys and Mr. Chapman came back to the bunkhouse for lunch. And there was Ben in bed. And Mr. Chapman told him he was never going to amount to a damn. Well, he found a better gig. He went to Hollywood.
I think so. Well, this is the 75-year anniversary of the cavalcade, and you told me something about that first cavalcade that involved those Cowboys up there.
That's another story they told at the Cowboy reunion. And what that was is they were getting ready to have the first International Roundup cavalcade, and they wanted, the organizers, whoever that was, wanted the Chapman-Barnard Cowboys to lead the parade. And so they asked Mr. Barnard, he was up there quite a bit, he said that'd be fine. And the reason this story was told is Jim Ronda said it was the Chapman-Barnard Ranch, and Ben Johnson was the foreman, but who was the ultimate boss? And they said that was Mr. Chapman. And so anyway, they told this story, and they asked Mr. Barnard if it'd be okay, and he said, yeah, that'd be fine. And so for several days, the guys were getting their tack all saddle soaped and cleaned up, and getting their horses curry combed and looking good, and practicing how they were going to ride. And Mr. Chapman showed up. Said, what are you boys doing? And they told him, said, well, we're going to have this parade in Pawhuska, and we're going to lead the parade. And he said, what are you going to do with those horses after the parade? He said, well, I guess we'll bring them back to the ranch. Why? He said, well, we're not having any parade horses on this ranch. And that ended it. That ended it right there.
He was kind of old school then, wasn't he?
He was old school, and he had his standards, and you were going to live to them. And, it's amazing. Mr. Chapman's story is amazing. I mean, when he died in 1966, he was supposedly the richest man west of the Mississippi. And a fella told me he left his son $40 million, and other than that, he disinherited him. He left almost his entire fortune to charity, including endowing 4 universities, one of them being the University of Tulsa.
Yep. Chapman Stadium, isn't it?
Yeah, I had some people up here at the preserve one year from Texas, and they were from Trinity University. That was another university he endowed. And I told them that story. And they said, well, that's why we have so many buildings on campus that have the Chapman name in Texas. But it's pretty amazing. He left almost everything he made to charity.
Yeah. Well, I hope that boy could get by on $40 million.
I think he did.
He could limp by on 40 mil.
Yeah.
You know, I got to think about that ranch up there, and I got to think about some things and some guys that I know. You know, Jimbo, once rodeo's in your blood, it's pretty hard to get it out of. There's something about this ranch up there, because it seems like about the time Ben Johnson Sr. went to work up there, he stepped away from rodeo to run this ranch. What do you know about Ben Johnson Sr.'s days there at the Chapman-Barnard Ranch?
Well, he was larger than life. I mean, he was originally from Arkansas, and I don't remember just when he came there, but he was the ranch foreman until his death in the mid-50s. And he was very, very highly thought of, but I don't think he quit rodeoing. He was a world champion cowboy, as was Ben Johnson Jr., as was Clyde Lowry, as was your granddad. I know the Chapman-Barnard Ranch produced 4 world champion cowboys, but Ben...
Clyde Lowry worked at the Chapman-Barnard Ranch.
Clyde Lowry worked there too.
Before he split off to over by Nowata area.
I don't know the story, but
he came from the Chapman-Barnard Ranch originally.
I don't know about originally, but I know he was working there.
And roping with Ben Johnson, I'm sure.
Well, and Henry Grammer,
Yeah.
and a number of others. I mean, you've got photos in here of a lot of those people. But Ben Johnson Sr. was very well respected. And one of the stories they told, I mean, he loved to gamble, and he would gamble on everything. And even he would bet in the barbershop when a fly would fly off the wall. But he had a foot racer named Slick Strayer. Ben always had a horse, a racehorse, and he always had a foot racer. And he would match his horse against your horse for however much you wanted to bet. And he would do the same with Slick Strayer. The Cowboys told one story. Ben had and Ben would have a horse in the race, but he was so well respected, he was the judge. You know, you didn't have a photo finish. You had to have a judge to determine which horse won the match race. And Ben was the judge. And, you know, both sides knew that he had a horse in the race, but he was respected enough that they thought he would be honest. So anyway, and you know, people would come from a long ways with a ringer to outrun whatever Ben had to run. And so they brought this horse in for a match race, and they bet $1,000 and went on that match race. And Ben knew that was all the money these people had. I don't know how he knew it, but that's what they said, is he knew they had $1,000. So they each put up $1,000. And the race was close, but Ben, as the judge, determined his horse won. And these guys were complaining. And he knew they didn't have any more money. He said, well, if you boys don't like my decision, let's just put up another 1,000 and run them again. He knew they couldn't do it.
Yeah.
But I got to tell you a Slick Strayer story. Slick was a famous foot racer. And a cowboy there on the ranch, his name's on that plaque up there. And like I said, everybody wanted to take a shot at having somebody that could outrun Slick. And so these other guys, they brought in a track star from the University of Oklahoma to the Chapman-Barnard Ranch to run Slick Strayer. An old cowboy that worked there. Well, wasn't old, but a cowboy that worked there. And so this track star was getting warmed up in his running clothes. He had his shorts and his running shirt and his running shoes. And Slick was taking all this in. He said, Ben, I think I better take my boots off to run this guy. And so he pulled off his boots. And he was watching that guy warm up, and he said, Ben, I think I better take my britches off too. So he ran in his skivvies, but he outran the track star from OU.
Yeah. I've heard of him. I've heard the name Slick Strayer.
I think I met his son or daughter here a while back.
Yeah.
They were in the museum talking about Slick and telling me some great foot racing stories on definitely how they used to haul him around and gamble on him.
Right.
Foot racing. So I think they said he ran dogs too quite a bit. Did he have race dogs?
Oh, he loved to hunt coyotes.
Okay.
He loved to hunt coyotes.
Ben Johnson had greyhounds.
Yeah,
too,
he had
didn't
greyhounds. Yeah. Well, that's who we're talking about is Ben. You talking about Slick or Ben?
I'm talking about Ben. Yes, sir.
Yeah,
yes,
Ben
sir.
loved to hunt. He loved to deer hunt, and he'd go out of state to deer hunt. But he loved to run coyotes with his greyhounds.
You mentioned Henry Grammer there. You touched on that. You said your grandfather knew Henry.
He more than knew him as my great-grandfather. My great-grandfather, that's an interesting story. He walked from 100 miles east of Springfield, Missouri, to the second land run in Oklahoma in 1891. He didn't even have a horse. Dad said the only way he had to support himself was with his rifle. And so he ran in the land run in 1891, settled in Lincoln County. And then he bought the adjoining claim and sold those and moved and bought the family's ranch in Kay County. But he traded in real estate. He owned quite a bit of land in different places, and you'd just buy it and sell it. And a lot of that was in Osage County. And he had a mortgage somehow. I don't know. He probably sold the land to Henry Grammer. I don't know for sure. But he had the mortgage on Henry Grammer's place when Henry died in 1923. And Henry's widow couldn't pay it and just wanted to deed it to him. Well, he wasn't really wanting to own it. But he wound up owning it anyway, had to foreclose later. But yeah, he knew Henry Grammer. Everybody knew. Everybody in the Shidler area knew Henry Grammer.
Right. Yeah, he was well known, not just as a roper, but as an outlaw, and had a lot of
bootlegger.
When
he died, he was found dead in a wrecked car south of Shidler in 1923 with $10,000 in his pocket. But people around there don't think he died in that car wreck. They think the car was wrecked and Henry was stuck in it, but he was dead.
Yeah.
And, you know, he and Bill Hale were big buddies. And you have to wonder if Bill Hale didn't think that maybe Henry Grammer knew a little too much.
Right. Could have been.
What about Howard Hughes when he bought the horses from the Chapman-Barnard Ranch?
Yeah.
How long did that go on, and how did you ever hear the story how that happened?
Well, yeah, I've heard the story several ways. I heard the story from the Rhodes brothers that from Fairfax that were working at the Chapman-Barnard Ranch, and they wanted them to go with them. And Ben Johnson Jr. went with the trainload of horses to California, and he stayed. And the Rhodes boys always wonder, you know, Cecil and Raisins Rhodes. That's another interesting, you know, all these cowboys, I'm sure you guys know, all these cowboys had nicknames. None of them ever went by their real name. I mean, Puny Martin, if you knew Puny, Mr. Chapman's driver, he was anything but puny. Puny was probably a 300-pounder, but his nickname was Puny. But one of the Rhodes brothers was named Raisins Rhodes, and they asked how he got that name. Well, you know, you've been up to the bunkhouse, I assume, at the preserve headquarters. Well, they've got that big table, and that's the original table that was there. All those cowboys that sat around it, and they were eating supper. And this fellow that became known as Raisins Rhodes loved cooked raisins. And so at the end of the supper, the cooked raisins were the dessert, and they passed the bowl around, and nobody took any but raisins. He got him a big handful or a big helping or other, and they went around again. He got him some more and got some more, and finally there was just a little bit left. He'd eaten them all. And so they passed them around again, and he took the rest and ate them, and Ben Johnson jumped up and said, "Mr. Chapman, he ate the whole bowl, pay me." That Ben Johnson and Mr. Chapman had a bet as to whether Cecil or Raisins Rhodes would eat the whole bowl of raisins. But that's one of the stories they told. That's not quite your question, but Raisins Roads was offered to go with Ben, and so was Cecil Roads, offered to go with Ben and the trainload of horses to California, and they stayed here in Cowboy, and they always wondered what would have happened to them if they had gone to Hollywood with Ben and stayed.
Yeah, it makes you wonder what would have happened. Sounds like he just drew the short straw and had to ride out there with the horses all the way to California.
Well, you know, I don't think Ben Johnson, I knew him pretty well, junior. I didn't know senior, but I knew junior. And he would, when he would come back here, you know, he would stay out here with his niece, Ann Whitehorn. And, but he liked to hang out over at Scheidler. My mother had a little grocery store, and he liked to hang out over there. And he would come back here from his home in Arizona 3 or 4 times a year and buy horses and take them back to Arizona and sell them for about 4 times what he paid for them here. But Ben knew horses, but I don't think Ben was really cut out to be a cowboy. I think he fit a lot better as an actor. But when he would speak at the cowboy reunion, I mean, he had a voice. You thought you were listening to God. He had a voice that was so powerful and so impressive.
We've kind of went over a whole lot on that Chapman-Barnard Ranch.
And there's a whole lot more.
Oh, yeah.
You get the right people here.
We could probably talk for 2 or 3 days.
And you know, that's the other thing. I mean, it wasn't all peaches and cream. The cowboys that told these stories that were recorded on videotape, they realized they'd told a few things they probably didn't really want to tell. And so they got in touch with Jim Ronda and said, would you mind taking this, that, or the other off of there? Because these cowboys weren't always angels. They had their faults, and all of them did. And sometimes they kind of told a few of those faults that they didn't really want to be public.
Cody, you weren't here when the Nature Conservancy was trying to buy that ranch, but there was a lot of controversy, wasn't there, Harvey? It wasn't well received here to start with.
No, it was very unpopular, and it started out as a federal proposal. Mm-hmm. And in 1984, an effort began here, and I was asked to be on a task force that Senator Don Nichols set up to look into the feasibility of doing a federal Tallgrass Prairie Preserve. It'd be owned and managed by the National Park Service. And a bill was introduced in the United States Senate in 1987 to do that. And in 1980, and the thing is, then you had some big chunks of wonderful ranch land that were for sale that hadn't been for sale for generations. I mean, there are stories about Ben Johnson bringing John Wayne here trying to buy the Chapman-Barnard Ranch, and they were told it wasn't for sale. And, you know, Mr. Adams, K.S. Adams, had 67,000 acres in Osage County, including the 4-acre ranch, 34,000 acres there. That's very, very nice. And they had turned down $400 an acre for it some years before. But times got hard with the Carter administration and 21 or 22% interest and price controls on cattle. You know, the price controls, the cattle got so high, the federal government put price controls on them, and they were going to come off in September of whatever year, and everybody thought the price would go through the roof. Well, instead it went through the floor. And so many, and so did land values. And land values were probably half what they'd been a few years before. And so you had all these ranchers that were flat on their back and no hope. And Chapman-Barnard, they were not in that position, but some other ranches were. Well, the Mormon Church came in 1988 and bought all of the Adams properties. So part of that land was to have been in the Tallgrass Prairie National Preserve. So the only chunk left was that was on the market of any substantial size was the 29,000 acre Barnard portion of the Chapman-Barnard Ranch. And in 1989, the Nature Conservancy bought that. If they hadn't, it had been bought by another ranching entity, probably the Mormon Church. Probably never be for sale, not in our lifetimes.
So you keep talking about the Nature Conservancy and the Tallgrass Prairie, and you know, everybody from around here kind of takes it for granted exactly what that is, but a lot of folks from a lot of other places watch this. Can you kind of explain exactly what those two things are to everybody?
Sure. The Nature Conservancy is a private, nonprofit conservation organization that was founded in 1951. and it's active in every state in the nation, and it's active in about 70 foreign countries, and their goal is to promote land conservation. And, you know, the National Geographic did a story on them in the 80s called Quietly Conserving Nature. I had never heard of the Nature Conservancy before they got involved here. Most people hadn't. And when the federal bill died and the Conservancy bought it, nobody knew who the Nature Conservancy was. They thought that was just another federal organization. And the few that did know who they were, and the Conservancy has had a practice of buying lands because they can act a lot quicker than Congress can, and then selling the land at cost to the federal government or state government or whatever. They've done that in the past, and people thought, well, that's what they're going to do here. Well, that's not their plan. The Tallgrass Prairie Preserve is now it's 40,000 acres. We've added to it. And the goal is to recreate a functioning tallgrass prairie ecosystem. And this ecosystem is only about 10 or 12,000 years old. It was produced by three principal ecological forces since the end of the last ice age. And those forces are climate. You know, in this part of the world, we get an average of about 38 inches of rain a year, but we also get hot, dry times. And so plants have to have, the native plants, if they're going to live, they have to have deep roots. It was produced by fire, burning at different seasons, not just burning in the spring, that's common in the ranching community here, but burning at different seasons. We commissioned Oklahoma State University to do a historical study, and they told us the principal time of fire here was in mid-October, historically. And those fires, they also told us 20,000 years ago we would be in a spruce jack pine forest, but it was transformed to a prairie by climate, by fire, and by grazing, primarily by bison. And the current species of bison is only about 6,000 years old. The earlier bison species that were here were larger, but they went extinct and were replaced by smaller ones. So the bison that we have now, they evolved on the plains, they shaped the plains, and the plains shaped them. So what we're doing at the Tallgrass Prairie Preserve is putting those ecological forces back into play, being controlled burns to mimic the seasonality of fires, and grazing by bison, so we can put those ecological forces back into play to allow the prairie to continue to evolve in whatever form it goes. So it's a big science project. It's the only functioning tallgrass prairie in the world.
Can people check that out?
Sure. You can Google that and you'll find out I'm right.
What do you? I believe every word you say, Harvey. Every word you say, I believe 100%. So people, they can go out there and they can drive and look at the buffalo.
Yes, there's a county road system through there, owned and maintained by Osage County. They can drive wherever they want on those county roads. They can't drive on the preserve roads. We've restored the old Chapman-Barnard headquarters that everybody in this community called the bunkhouse. The Chapman and Barnard families called it the headquarters, but Jimbo...
I always called it the bunkhouse.
That's right.
You know.
That's right. Yeah. And so Chevron gave us a grant early on to restore that. When we had the first cowboy reunion, that old bunkhouse, built in 1920, it's on the National Register of Historic Places now. It was so bad, it had holes in the roof, there were windows out, the floors, the wooden floors were rotten. The cowboys that came to that reunion asked us if we were going to keep it or bulldoze it. It was that bad. And so Chevron gave us the money to restore that. And even Mary Barnard Lawrence approved of how it was done. She was Mr. Barnard's daughter, she was very active in the rest of her life with the Tallgrass Prairie Preserve. And she very much approved. First of all, she very much approved of the Nature Conservancy buying their family's legacy, because that ranch was so important to them. They loved it and cherished it, and they knew the Conservancy would take good care of it, be good stewards of the land. But she also approved of everything we did in restoring the bunkhouse, which to me, that was the litmus test.
Yeah, that made you feel good, I'm sure.
It sure did. And she lived and worked up there during World War II.
Yeah.
I saw on the internet here just a while back something about some new wildlife moving up in the area up there that hadn't been there in quite some time. Otters. I'm not sure what's going on. I saw some pictures on Facebook. I didn't. So I know that you know everything about it because y'all are the ones that put it on there. So I've been real anxious to ask you about these otters.
Well, the otters, I haven't seen any on the preserve. I'm sure they're there. The otters that we saw were on Bird Creek here east of Pawhuska. But I'm sure they're on Sand Creek. The Sand Creek flows down through the middle of the preserve. The preserve is designed around the upper Sand Creek drainage. A very high quality stream, a lot like Bird Creek is here. And I'm sure that otters will be there. But we have other species that aren't so nice, like feral hogs. Those are a big problem. We spend a lot of money every year trying to control them. Exotic species are generally a problem, but otters, river otters, are native. They're not exotic. They were here historically. But, like about everything, when I was a kid and Jimbo was a kid, everything that could get shot did. I mean, deer were thick here historically. We didn't have any deer when I was a kid. Wild turkeys were thick historically. We didn't have any wild turkeys when I was a kid. Bison, 30 to 60 million bison on the plains, they were almost completely extinct. Antelope, Dad knew an old cowboy that would say on Sunday afternoons they went up to Grainola, or 4 Acre rather, and chased antelope with their greyhounds back in the 1800s. And they're gone. Nobody's ever seen an antelope here in their lifetime.
Have you ever thought of, has there ever been any thought of putting some antelope back up there? I always thought they'd look good up there. Every time I drive through that, I think, boy, they'd look good, some antelope there on the side of that hill.
There's been some talk about that and some movement, but nothing's come to fruition.
Yeah. Cody, when I was a kid, there were herds of white deer up there, fallow deer. And Harvey tells me they're not there anymore, but you'd see them.
But they're not native.
No, they were brought in by probably one of the ranch owners.
Probably by Chapman-Barnard. Yeah. But historians told us the most numerous animal here historically was bison. The second most numerous animal was elk. And they were killed out in Oklahoma by 1830. And it was market hunters. There was a big French operation on the Arkansas River east of Newkirk in 1750 and 1751, hunting bison and salting the meat and the hides and shipping them down the Arkansas River. But most of the wildlife, passenger pigeons, they were here, they're gone. Carolina parakeets, they're gone.
Horny toads.
They're gone too. Haven't seen any of them in a long time.
I saw one up there on Bass Brothers.
Did you? I
think last year. I picked him up and showed him to everybody. It was a young one, and I put him back down. But that's the first one I'd seen in a long time.
Yeah. But what the Conservancy is doing is trying to replicate the ecological forces so that all native wildlife and plants and animals as well has a place to live.
That's very admirable, for sure.
It's a great place,
It's a big science project. We get a lot of people coming to see that.
People come from all over the world, seems like, to come see the Tallgrass Prairie up there. We meet them every day. They're asking directions. They're saying, I started headed up there, but I never saw anything. I said, well, you just got to keep going, and then you'll run into something up there.
I work on an oil lease up there on Bass Brothers, and I drive that road a lot. And I see so many people with the photographers, with big old long lens, and stuff. And they're parked on the side of the road all the time taking pictures.
But one other thing that's making a comeback that's pretty exciting, or it is to me, is trumpeter swans and tundra swans. And, they were here historically. They're very prominent in Osage literature. But I never saw one until a few years ago. Lisa and I saw one on that pond you were talking about that we call it the Swan Pond now. They're west of the headquarters. Yep. They come here for the winter. But they have the largest wingspan of any bird in the world.
Wow.
And the people thought they were extinct a number of years ago, and they found a population of them in a remote location in Alaska. and they've restored that bird to now they're pretty common here in the winter.
They're beautiful birds, and they're so big. That's what blew me away. They were just so huge. But that's the only place I've ever seen them. I've lived in Osage County my whole life, and that's the only place I've ever seen them. Was on 2 different ponds up there, one on Bass Brothers and one of them on the preserve.
You know, I was driving up there by Scheidler here a while back, and I saw more hawks than I've ever seen just north of Scheidler. Is that because of the feed grounds around there, or
those are overwintering hawks? We get a lot of overwintering hawks in this part of the world. We have a number that nest here, but we will have several times more hawks in the winter than we have. But what they're hunting primarily would be voles that live in the Tallgrass Prairie.
There's an unbelievable amount of them up there just north of Scheidler.
It really is.
You know, photography, Harvey. When did you start this love of photography?
Well, I had a love of the outdoors all my life. Of course, we lived in about as remote an area as you can live, and you know, it was very, very pristine, unplowed tallgrass prairie, except for the bottomlands that were fields. And you know, I'd see these wildflowers, and I remember when I saw the first deer track when they were reintroduced by the Wildlife Department in 1960, and it was like you had seen the Holy Grail. I mean, my goodness. And but I developed an interest in photography at an early age. The only limiting factor was no money. And you know, one time when I was a kid, I sold these little scratch-off tickets where you would make a few dollars, and I used my earnings as part of the sales process to buy this little Ansco camera, little piece of plastic that never did work. And so until I finished my formal education, I didn't have any money at all to buy anything like a camera. And so, but after I got out of college and law school, I started saving enough money to buy a decent 35 millimeter camera, and then just progressed from there.
Do you prefer landscape? Do you prefer action shots on wildlife? Has it changed a little bit through the years on what you prefer to shoot?
I was a very avid hunter much of my life, and I've kind of outgrown that in the last few years. But I think hunters are generally better wildlife photographers than people that aren't hunters, because to be able to hunt wildlife, you have to know their habits and how to find them and where they live, and taking their photo is a lot tougher than shooting them with a gun. But to answer your question, I probably prefer wildlife more than anything. But in this part of the world, we have some really nice landscapes too. And we have nice, unpolluted skies for the most part. And we get some pretty sunrises and sunsets. We get some pretty clouds. We get some nice, pretty, unbroken vistas. And you can go out on a lot of these places, like you mentioned, the Tallgrass Prairie Preserve or Lee Bass, and you can take a photograph of something, and it would have looked about the same if you'd taken that photo 200 years ago or whenever. Take out a few highline poles or whatever, and sometimes you don't even have to have them in there. But we're pretty lucky in this part of the world to have so much in the way of natural resources and natural beauty. But to answer your question, I probably prefer wildlife the most, and then landscapes second, and wildflowers. I really enjoy wildflowers.
All the books you published, are they all photography books, or some of them written book?
Well, the first one I did was called Big Blue Stem, Journey into the Tall Grass. And the author was named Onyx Smith, and I did the contemporary photography. She has a lot of historical photographs in there as well. Then I did a book about the history of Washington County. I'm good. And had a fellow that was an elderly historian named Edgar Weston showed me around a lot of historical places in Washington County. So I did the contemporary photography for that. We've done a couple of small books for the tall grass that were written by a fellow named Jink Jones Jr. out of Tulsa. He was a writer for a newspaper all of his life. very talented writer and a volunteer at the preserve. And he did 2 books. The first one was called Tallgrass Growing, and I did the photography for that one. The second one he did was called Dreams Can Come True, and I did the photography for that one. But I met Jim Ronda in December of 1990. And Jim is one of the country's leading experts on Lewis and Clark, and was a friend of Ken Burns, a friend of Dayton Duncan that writes Ken Burns documentaries, has worked with Ken Burns as a consultant and on camera on his documentary about Lewis and Clark. And we were looking at building a research station at the Tallgrass Prairie Preserve, which became very important. So we had a committee. And so TU, it was going to be a joint project with the University of Tulsa and the Nature Conservancy. So the Conservancy appointed 3 people and TU appointed 3 people. One of the people appointed was Jim Ronda. And so we had a meeting one day at the University of Tulsa, and we broke for lunch and went to Gilcrease, which is in Osage County, at the rendezvous room. And for an hour, I listened to Jim Ronda talk about Lewis and Clark, because that was the bicentennial of their Lewis and Clark voyage. And I was mesmerized. I was just totally blown away. And I thought, boy, if a chance ever comes to do a book with this man, I would jump at it. And so here, some years ago, probably, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago, I was approached by University of Oklahoma, and they wanted me to do a book about the Tallgrass Prairie. And I said, I'm not a writer. And they said, we've heard that before, but that's not always proven to be true. And I said, well, I can assure you that that's the case. And they said, well, if you won't do it, who do you have in mind? And I said, Jim Ronda. And this fellow that was the managing editor for the University of Oklahoma Press had worked with Jim Ronda in Montana. And he said, if you can get Jim Ronda, that would be wonderful. And so I called Jim and asked him, and he said, let me think about it. And he thought about it for about 6 months. And finally he said, I'll do it. And when he did it, it was like watching poker playing on TV, where they shove all their chips to the middle of the table. He was all in. And this was his 11th book. His book that to me is a classic is Lewis and Clark Among the Indians, and it's the Indian perspective of the Lewis and Clark expedition. It sold over 200,000 copies. But he wrote the text for Visions of the Tallgrass. Lisa helped with it, and Jim's wife, Jean, helped with it. And that was published by the University of Oklahoma. It was released in September of 2018. And Jim did the story. He put his heart and soul into that book. He told me it was his favorite book of all the 11 he's done. It's pretty remarkable. And so I'm very proud of that book.
I can't wait to check it out. We'll probably start carrying it here in the gift shop for anybody that's wanting it out there after you watch this.
Harvey,
Real soon.
You used to own some land over in eastern Osage County. You grew up in western Osage County, but you own a ranch over in eastern Osage County. It has kind of a colorful past.
Boy, it has more than that. This was what I call the Lost Creek Ranch, and Lost Creek originates just southwest of Okesa. And Okesa was the historic outlaw hangout for Osage County. And most of those outlaws hung out on this place. And one fellow, an old cowboy here, told me when he was a kid, he could ride his horse any place in this part of the world he wanted to except Lost Creek, because that's where the outlaws were. He couldn't go there. But yeah, they had several pretty historic things happen there in the way of outlaws. The most interesting one to me occurred in 1911, and that's when they would ship the money to pay the Osages their quarterly headright payments. They would ship them, they'd ship the money on a rail car and pay them in cash. And so these outlaws decided they were going to rob the train. And so this place I had a cut railroad bed. It cut through a hillside, through a hill. And so it was real high on either side. And that's where outlaws stopped the train, at that cut. and they got the wrong train. They didn't get the one that had the money. So they robbed the passengers, and they stole the moonshine alcohol that was on there and made their escape. And so a posse was formed, and a posse took up the trail to catch these train robbers. And they somehow wound up at the Revelette House north of Pawhuska. And that's where Elmer Mccurdy was in the hayloft in a barn there. And Elmer Mccurdy, in the ensuing standoff, got shot. And they brought the outlaws, declared him the train robber, and brought him back to Pawhuska, took him to the Johnson Funeral Home, where he was embalmed with a lot of arsenic.
That's right beside us here. Right. Literally, we share a parking lot. So
yeah, and nobody claimed the body until 5 years later. And so what they would do, they'd prop him up in storefronts sometimes on Halloween. They would check him out for Halloween. And 5 years to the day he died, two guys showed up from California and told the undertaker that they were his brothers from California, and they'd promised their parents on their deathbed that they would go to Oklahoma and get their son's body and take him back to California for a proper burial. Well, the truth of the matter is they had a carnival sideshow. And so Elmer Mccurdy, from 1916, started touring the country as the Oklahoma outlaw and wound up in California. And he was in The $6 Million Man. He was in some TV shows. And he was in a spook house in Los Angeles and painted orange. And everybody thought he was a wax dummy until an arm fell off and there was a bone in the arm. And it had some wire attached to it, so it had fallen off before. But and this was in the 70s. This was in the mid-70s.
wow.
Elmer Mccurdy was in his mid-30s when he died, and he toured the country for 60 years as a corpse. But the L.A. coroner said that he could come back to Oklahoma. He's buried at Boot Hill at Guthrie. And they wanted him buried under 6 feet of concrete because they didn't want him touring the country anymore. But there are two books that I know of. The first one is The Career of Elmer Mccurdy, Deceased. And then a fellow from New York City called me in my office here some years ago and said, I'm writing a book about Elmer Mccurdy. Have you ever heard of him? I said, I sure have. Well, BBC, from London, came over and did a documentary there on that place about Elmer Mccurdy.
They need to do a whole movie. Martin Scorsese dropped this other deal. Get on Elmer over there.
That's right.
You said the Revelette House. Is that the one up north by the old Cover Ranch?
Yes, it is.
Okay, I know where that's at. I didn't know that was where that he was shot.
Yeah, well, Ray Taylor told me that he had some of his Ray was an old man when he died, I don't know, 15 years ago or so?
Probably.
Some of his relatives lived in that house, and they told him that Elmer Mccurdy had been drunk in that barn for 30 days before the posse showed up and shot him. So
with that whiskey that he stole from the train, I guess a lot of it. He just got like $46 or something, didn't he?
It wasn't much. Yeah. I don't know.
Was that the last train robbery in Oklahoma, or is it another one?
The last train robbery was in 1923, and it was on that same place that I used to have by Okesa.
Okay, that's where I got confused there.
Edgar Weston, the historian that showed me around Washington County for the book about the history of Washington County, told me all about that robbery. It was in 1923, I think in August, and what they did is there was a train station at Okesa. One of the gang's men got on the train at Okesa, so it would have to stop and wouldn't have any head of steam when it left town. As you go south, just out southwest, just after you leave Okesa, there are two railroad bridges. They stopped the train that didn't have any speed yet. They stopped it between those two bridges and robbed the train. And that was Al Spencer's gang. And they made their getaway horseback over that big hill to the southwest. Edgar Weston told me he was 7 years old when that happened. Al Spencer was killed within 30 days after that robbery. And the sanitized version is he was killed by a posse. But Milton Labadie told me that some of his relatives told him that he was killed by his own men, and that the posse retrieved the body and tied him up to a tree and filled him full of lead. But the coroner said that those bullet holes the posse shot into him didn't bleed. He was already dead. But that was in 1923, and that was the last train robbery in Oklahoma.
It didn't seem like those outlaws, the most famous ones, the most iconic, the most legendary, whatever you want to say about them, they really didn't have very long careers at the end of the day. But, you know, their legend lasts for a long, long time after them, which seems like maybe a guy like Al Spencer would have been on a crime spree for more than that or something.
Well, he didn't just start with that train robbery.
Yes, sir.
He's pretty well known.
He didn't really look like a cowboy in the pictures I've seen of him.
And if you read Outlaw's End, that's a little booklet.
Henry Wells.
Yeah.
We sell it here in the gift shop.
Do you really?
Yes, sir. I'll give you a copy when you leave.
I've got a copy.
Oh, okay.
But they talk in there about Pretty Boy Floyd going to abduct Frank Phillips over at Willow Rock, and they tipped him off. Pretty Boy Floyd didn't get it done. But Henry Wells, he talks about outlaws in those caves overlooking Lost Creek out by Okesa.
There's a lot of stories about outlaw caves on the creek banks around here. Seems like there's a lot of ranchers tell a lot of different stories about a secret cave on the creek bank that they don't want anyone else going into, that the outlaws hung out in.
One out west of town that's got a Dalton name chiseled in the side of the cave.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I believe that's a.
What about the whiskey?
I know right where that's at. Right where that's at. I've been to that one actually.
Yeah,
one time in my life.
You mentioned the Whiskey Trail.
Yeah, Whiskey Trail ran, and this was told to me by a resident of Okesa, that it ran from Okesa to Nalogany. It was a wagon trail. But, you know, there were a lot of stills in those hills out there by Okesa, and they were making moonshine whiskey. And I'm sure they hauled a lot of other things, but I'm sure they hauled their share of moonshine whiskey on the Whiskey Trail too. It got its name for a reason. It wasn't because of corn or wheat or something like that. Or not corn in a bushel.
Mm-hmm.
What about John Joseph Matthews? What can you tell us about John Joseph Matthews? I can tell you a lot about
John Joseph Matthews.
Cody, I knew him. I remember him as a kid real well.
A very, very, very intelligent man, a very forward thinker, far ahead of his time. I mean, he was first Osage to go to Oxford. John Joseph Matthews, I met him in 1973. I came here to have a job in the district attorney's office. Started on April 23, 1973, on a Monday. On a Tuesday, Tom Drummond took me to the Rotary meeting as his guest, and the speaker was John Joseph Matthews. And he was showing a film of prairie chickens on the booming ground on what's now the Tallgrass Prairie Preserve. And I was just blown away. I couldn't believe it. I thought, man, I'd like to do that. And so that's how I met John Joseph Matthews. But the Conservancy now owns his cabin that he built in 1932 out on land that was allotted to him in the tribal allotment under the June 28, 1906 allotment bill. That 40 acres where his cabin was allotted to him. So the chain of title went from the federal government to the Cherokee tribe, to the Osage tribe, to John Joseph Matthews. That's a pretty short chain of title.
For sure.
But yeah, he Oxford educated, went to school in Pawhuska, captain of the football team here, went to the University of Oklahoma, tried to play football and couldn't cut it. World War I broke out. He dropped out of OU and joined the Army. And he was placed in the Signal Corps, which much later became the Air Force. And he flew a biplane. He was a pilot in World War I, but he never left the country. He was an instructor. His daughter, if you read Our Osage Hills, if you don't have that book, you should. Michael Snyder wrote a book with John Joseph Matthews, and it's based upon Matthews' stories that were in the local newspaper under the column of Our Osage Hills. Just signed by JJM. He didn't even give his name. But he's annotated those and added to them. And he describes Matthew's daughter as having a vivid imagination. Well, she told me stories about him fighting the Red Baron in Europe. He never left the country. But Matthews, after World War I ended, he went back to OU, got a degree in geology, and then went to Oxford. He loved to hunt. He was accepted into Oxford, supposed to start in the fall term. Instead of going to Oxford, he went on a big game hunt in Wyoming and Montana. And he didn't get there till the second term. He almost didn't get in, but went to Oxford University, got a degree in natural sciences, kicked around Europe a while. And one thing that really impressed him was he was in northern Africa and he saw these old Roman ruins. And there was an old bathhouse. And on that bathhouse was a Latin inscription that translates to hunt, to bathe, to laugh, to play, that is to live. Or to play, to laugh, that is to live. And he thought, that is so cool. I'm going to adopt that as the motto for my life. So after he got through kicking around Europe, he moved back to Oklahoma, to Osage County, built a cabin in 1932. And that Latin inscription is on that fireplace mantle that he built. He wrote his first book. It's called Wakanta. That was published in 1932. The central figure in Wakanta was the Indian agent here that was Laban Miles, that was so popular, so well loved and respected. And the Indian agent's home was directly across the street from the Matthews home. Well, Laban Miles was not only the Indian agent, his wife was the aunt of, Herbert Hoover, that's right. And so Laban Miles was his uncle and guardian, and Herbert Hoover would come and stay with his guardian in the summer across the street from the Matthews home. Well, it was published in 1932 when Hoover was president. And so it became a huge seller. It became an alternate selection of the Book of the Month, and it launched Matthews' literary career in a big way. And he was so big that he was solicited by a New York publisher to write a novel, which was his second book called Sundown. And it's based upon the difficulties a person of mixed white and Indian blood goes through. He didn't really fit into either culture and all the inner struggles he had. His daughter told me, isn't an author's first novel based on their own life? And then he built that cabin, and then his third book that was published in his lifetime is called Talking to the Moon. And that was based upon listening to coyotes talking to the moon. And that was based upon the first 10 years of his life in the cabin. His fourth book was called E.W. Marlin, Life and Death of an Oil Man, history of E.W. Marlin, a pretty famous figure out of Ponca. But Matthew's most famous work is called The Osages, Children of the Middle Waters. And Matthews, being very well educated, very articulate, he was also very active in the Osage tribe. He was on the tribal council. He is credited with being the person, more than anybody else, that caused their mineral reservation to be extended. The June 28, 1906 allotment bill provided for the reservation of the oil, gas, coal, and other minerals for 25 years, at which time it would revert to the landowner unless otherwise provided by Congress. Well, at that time, when that bill was enacted, the oil play was nothing, and that didn't amount to much. But when that was after 25 years, the Osages were the richest native peoples in the world. And so there was a lot of pressure to extend that mineral reservation. Matthews led the lobbying delegation to D.C. with some other Osage leaders to extend that, and successfully did so. He's also credited with establishing the first tribally owned museum in the country, the Osage Tribal Museum, now Osage Nation Museum. His sister Lillian was the first curator. But with Matthew's standing within the tribe, he could speak to the old full-blood Osages that were clinging to their ancestral ways. And you had a real turbulence within the tribe. You had mixed bloods that were pushing for white man's ways. And they felt like their old medicine that had served them for centuries and generations, for thousands of years, was no longer working, and that they needed to adopt white man's ways and white man's medicine. The full-bloods, and you probably remember seeing Osages at Fairfax in the middle of the summer wrapped in a wool blanket. I do. It may be 100 degrees, and they'd be wrapped in a wool blanket. They were clinging to their ancestral ways, and they knew that their knowledge, and the Osages didn't have a written history. It was all oral history. And they knew that they were a dying breed. And the current mixed blood Osages didn't have any interest in the old ways. And they knew that if something wasn't done, when they died, that knowledge would be lost forever. So they talked to Matthews. It's not something they would talk to just anybody about, but they told him all of their old tribal customs, beliefs, mores, etc. And so Matthews chronicled that in his 5th book, The Osages, Children of the Middle Waters, that was published in 1961. If Matthews hadn't done that, that knowledge would have been lost. A lot of it would have been lost. Then he's had 2 more books published posthumously. 20,000 Mornings, which was the first 2 parts of what was supposed to be a 3-part autobiography. And then Old Three Toes and Other Tales of Survival and Extinction, which is a compilation of short stories Matthews wrote. Matthews died in 1979, and he's buried there in the yard by his cabin. Conservancy now owns that. It's been restored. We were having regular docent-led tours out there, but we had to cancel that with COVID. One of the docents is a relative of Matthews. It's pretty neat having people go listen to the story of John Joseph Matthews and being told the story by one of his relatives. When we acquired title to that, one of the first persons I took out there was Jeffrey Standing Bear, the Osage chief. And he stood in front of that fireplace with the mantle, with the Latin inscription, took his cap off, put it over his heart, and he said, "John Joseph Matthews was my hero. He did more than anybody else for the Osages." That's pretty strong.
That's very strong.
Sorry you asked the question.
No. No, I wanted to know the importance of him personally, and my kids are Osage. I'm not, but my kids are, so I'm going to want them to know the importance of John Joseph Matthews.
You know, to underscore the importance of Matthews within the Osage tribe, a few years ago, and you may have relatives that were in the Osage immersion class, where they're teaching little kids the Osage language that they came close to losing. And they wanted to do the class portrait of 32 or 3 kids in the Osage immersion class. And so I was contacted by one of the people conducting the class and said, could we take their class portrait at the Matthews cabin? And I thought, my God, you look at the Osage campus up here, it's spectacular. They've got the museum that's a treasure. They've got the superintendent's home. They've got the 3rd Osage Agency building. They've got the Osage Ranch, or the Osage Nation Ranch, the former Bluestem Ranch. They've got a lot of places with a lot of tribal culture where they could take these kids' portraits, but they wanted to take them at the Matthews cabin. And we didn't even have an outhouse out there. Matthews didn't have an outhouse. We have a porta potty now, out of necessity. But we took those kids out there, and it was a cold morning. And I thought, well, they'll just all line up, everybody will smile, and I'll take a picture and go home. Wrong. They took each person individually. They took probably 100 photos of each student in that class, and it took most of the day. And I was touched by that. I thought that is so remarkable that they think that much of John Joseph Matthews that they would go out there instead of other properties that the Osages own.
Cody, he used to dress, he was a flamboyant figure, as I remember him. He was tall and had his gray hair would be down on the back of his neck, and he wore a little hat of some kind and buckskin clothes a lot of times, and that's the way I remember him. He was a really flamboyant figure.
And he often looked like he was going on safari. A lot of times he had on a safari-looking coat.
Yeah.
Yeah, I had a chance to buy some of his artwork and stuff here a while back, and I've been really kicking myself in the tail for not doing it. But it's probably in good hands now anyway. Someone that really appreciates it probably has it now. Well, Harvey, Mr. Payne, there's a lot of famous people came from the Osage, and I heard you telling Jimbo a little story out in the hallway a while ago about about little Opie that came from up in this country.
Yeah.
Ron Howard, can you fill us in on that a little bit?
Well, Lisa's a friend of his on Facebook.
Okay. We need to get him up here, Lisa.
But his dad lived, maybe a mile or mile and a half down the creek from where my dad was born and raised. Dad was born in that house where he lived. And Opie's dad was named Harold Beckenholtz. And they lived in a house just down Little Beaver Creek, a short distance from Dad. And he and Dad went to school together. And in fact, he died the same year Dad did, in 2017. And he would get in touch with Dad quite a bit. They'd come and see, he and his wife would come and see Dad and Mom. And my brother John has a rodeo act, and whenever John was in California, Rance Howard would always come to his performances and look him up and talk to him. But went off to bigger and better things, but it's pretty interesting.
Pretty interesting that Ron Howard, I guess he's born in Scheidler area?
I imagine he was born in California. I don't know where Ron Howard was born.
Oh, okay. Okay, so we don't know his story right there in Scheidler. So,
but when you're starting to talk about Scheidler, that's a pretty interesting part of the world, and especially Whizbang or Denoya. They had one oil well come in there on the north side of town that flowed 2,500 barrels of oil a day. Now that's a lot of oil. But with that, it attracted a lot of people. And not all of them were upstanding. They said they had a shooting at Whizbang every night. But that's a different story.
I know I'd like to get into your brother with you too, John Payne, a little bit, but we're going to be doing him in a few days so he can tell on his own self on all the great stories that you can probably tell on him. So
I can tell you, John, growing up, there was only one John. He has always heard a little bit different drum beat than about everybody else. And I don't say that in a negative way.
No, he's really something else. He's really made something out of himself, and we're looking real forward to talking to John here in a few days for sure about his interesting career and interesting life, and his place over there is pretty interesting too when you drive by it and look at it. Well, Jimbo, do you got anything else for Mr. Payne today?
Well, I'd just like to thank him for coming in, first and foremost, but some of the stories he's told, you're not going to find those in books, and some of them I've never even heard, and we really appreciate him being the historian he is and keeping this history going, and hopefully on this podcast, it'll people for generations to come will hear some of this stuff, and you need that, you don't want to see that history gone and lost forever.
We'd like to have him in another time or two, probably to talk about a few other things. Harvey, I end every podcast by asking someone a pretty ridiculous question. So a lot of times, some life advice, what you would give your son or daughter or this or that. But, we're hoping some younger people that are into this kind of way of life will want to learn a little bit about this. But can you just give the younger generation coming up some advice on how important your history is, where you come from, and the history around you, to try to preserve that and learn that, the importance of that?
I don't think that can be overstated. The first thing you learn in history is if you want to predict the future, look at the past. And you can carry that back about as far as you want. I read a story just a few days ago about researchers uncovering human DNA that was over 40,000 years old from a cave in Bulgaria. And we tend to get wrapped up in our life and our times now. But we've got to remember that where we are today, we're here because of the efforts of a lot of other people that came before us. And you look around this town, and I know some of you lived here a long time, and think about the people that made this town what it is. And it's pretty touching. I mean, we get so tied up in our day-to-day struggles and our day-to-day lives, we think that's all that really matters. But you know, you look at the people that built Pawhuska, but then you keep going back in time, and you look at the Native American aspect of things, and I think that is so special. I mean, I have Cherokee blood from both parents, but I am so fascinated with the Osage culture. I know a lot more about that than I do Cherokee. And we can learn so much from earlier peoples, and they learned lessons the hard way. And if you look at this landscape, and you know, we live out east of town along Bird Creek, and we know that people have lived there for 12,000 years or so because they found a Clovis point south of our barn in the 40s. And those are roughly 10 to 12,000 years old. So you look across this landscape and just imagine the people that have walked these hills and crossed these streams. And you know, you turn on the tap and instantly you have a glass of pure, clean water. And I was thinking, you know, the Indians that lived here, right here where we live, they had to go get it out of Bird Creek and figure out some way to carry it. But we can learn so much from people that came before us. And if we lose our sense of history, you know, we're just like a ship on the ocean without a rudder. We don't have any place to go, and we don't know how to get there.
Thank you, Harvey.
Thank you.
I hope a lot of people can take something from that, because those are some big words from a big man right here. Harvey's a world traveler, world renowned. I was going to say book writer, but that's not the right word. He's an author, picture taker, photographer. You know, it's been a real honor to have you here, Harvey.
Well,
Mr. Payne. He gets mad at me for calling him Mr. Payne. I'm trying to call him Harvey, and it's just real hard. It's just real hard. So if you want to learn more about the Tallgrass Prairie, it's right here, just north of Pawhuska. You drive right up there. You can learn everything you want to know, and you can see what prairie land is supposed to look like from untouched prairie land. That's what it's supposed to look like up there. And if you want to learn more about the Chapman-Barnard Ranch, you can come right here to the Ben Johnson Museum, right down the hill from the Tallgrass Prairie, and learn all you want to know about all the great cowboys and Western figures from our area. And his family's real deep into all that too. You'll see them all in this museum right here. So thank you for coming. Thanks, Jimbo. You coming too, man. I appreciate you.
You got it.
All right. We'll see everybody next week on Cowboys of the Osage podcast. Thank you, guys.